We're opening to questions for all speakers together. Professor Prof.
Thanks very much. It's fortunately 10, and then my question would be relevant to all three speakers. Two issues which have not been mentioned because of time constraints, obviously, medical supply and access to hospitals, which looks to me crucial. And the second issue might be relevant specifically to Ruvi, and a question about property rights. Because people are departing, are bound to depart, and are becoming refugees based on the 1951 covenant. What about their property rights? Who is going, do we have any institutions which will take care of compensation? This is about enforceability, and in order to be the normative software.
Okay, on the medical points.
I guess I'll very briefly. I just want to pictures going to say speak louder words. I just want to. This is a picture of my cell phone of the Mykolaiv hospital as the head doctor showed me what the Russians did to it the night before. Yeah. Take a look at that. So this is what the point of this photograph. I can show anyone who wants later that the Russians are going. They haven't gone in full Syria, but they're absolutely willing to do it. Then they have bombed Ukrainian hospitals. They've double-tapped Ukrainian hospitals. Double-tap, of course, is when you tap again the second time you bomb in order to kill first responders. It's, of course, horrific. The export treaty, the Greek corridor, has nothing to do with medical stuff, and the Russians are so perhaps legitimately terrified of weapons coming into the port that there's no provision for anything in terms of containers, right? It's only foreign, it's only grain. The medical stuff that is coming in comes through Romania, comes through Poland, to a certain extent through Hungary, although they're a problem, and through Romania, and a little bit through Moldova, but that's not a NATO country, so they don't. And that's got a lot of Russians in it. Bad stuff, so they don't really use the Moldovan corridor. There's enough medical stuff coming in terms of supplies, but there are bottlenecks and operational issues with logistics getting it from Lviv and from the Romanian border somewhere like Czernowitz to where it needs to be, so that everyone is giving enough to the Ukrainians. Certainly, although if you want to use your own personal money to buy blood coagulation kits for the Ukrainian soldiers, they're not going to say no, we need them. There are guys who die because they don't have access to them. But the issues are logistics, actually getting it to Donbass, getting it to Prigori, getting it to Kherson. And there's no lack of international institutions, including the Israeli government, to its great credit, which opened a field hospital and has sent doctors and all this. So. Do you want to say something?
Diane, do you have anything with regard to any points? The medical points?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question all too well.
Okay.
But I am responding to a question on the chat, in particular, the peremptory norm that I've been asked about, and I'm referring to the prohibition of aggression, but most importantly, the prohibition of racial discrimination in the enjoyment of the human right to food. And so that's the hook that I'm looking at insofar as peremptory norms are concerned.
Yeah. Should I respond to the point about property rights? So I mean, it's a really interesting point. I mean, I think so if you think about refugee law more generally, so both the 51 Convention, but in fact all instruments, regional in the different regions, and including Europe, direct all the obligations towards domestic expected. So there's nothing in these treaties that pertain to the behavior of the state of origin, as it were. And there were quite a lot of questions actually back in the 80s and 90s, in the 80s particularly in relation to Soviet Russia, of whether there should be a right of the receiving states with bear some costs, etc., to receive compensation from the state that is responsible, in a sense, for the departing refugee. Of course, in this context, I said the complication is that it isn't really Ukraine that is responsible for the fact that Ukrainians have to flee Ukraine. It's Russia that is responsible, and so there's an indirect link. So I would say in terms of that framework in international law, I'm not sure it has a direct remedy. What I would say is, when it comes to the conclusion of the conflict, whether there should be an obligation on the Russian state in whatever negotiations there are for compensation that takes into account the destruction of property. I mean, that in the past, of course, some international agreements would have had this. The challenge, of course, is that they tend to be agreements between states. They tend to not be agreements where the Russian state would be compensating an individual Ukrainian for their house having been destroyed. And the assumption there is that the Ukrainian state will help its own peoples. I think until and unless, that kind of perhaps wraps it up, that until and unless, however, property is restored in one way or another, so there is a rebuilding, that would of course strengthen the claims of people who have sought protection elsewhere that they can't go back, because part of the claim around livelihood may not be a direct claim in the Refugee Convention, but certainly in wider protection frameworks, the idea that repatriation should only happen in circumstances where one can regain one's livelihood of pre-departure. I think if you return to places where the infrastructure is really entirely destroyed, then some states may argue there should be an inter-flight alternative consequence. They should return to other parts of Ukraine which haven't been destroyed. But I think that's a debate that will happen once the conflict is resolved.
Hi, yes, hi Diane. Thanks all for the very interesting presentations. I have a question for Diane. I hope you can hear me. Okay, so two brief ones. The first one is, can you say a bit more on the relationship between IHL and the International Covenant here, and why you would be drawing on the Covenant as opposed to IHL? And the second one is, I remember a debate we had during dealing with the COVID vaccines, where arguments were made that the fact that that vaccine hoarding by rich Western states actually was in violation of their human rights obligations under the International Covenant. And so I was wondering about making a similar argument here with regard to not just the Ukrainian population, but with regard to the broader ramifications for the global community and the food crisis that you've shown at the beginning of your talk.
Thank you very much for the question. As the International Court of Justice clarified in its advisory wall opinion, international human rights law does not only have extraterritorial effect, but also applies even in cases of continuing armed conflict. So to the extent that IHL and international human rights law are read side by side, there is no suspension of obligations of international human rights law that Russia has in this particular instance, notwithstanding the separate regime of international humanitarian law that Russia is also violating. In fact, this was recognized by the OSCE panel of experts report in pointing out both human rights violations as well as IHL violations by Russia. To your point on the possibility that hoarding or taking intentional actions to impair global food supplies on the part of Russia, which it's really doing as a way to extort or to extract concessions for further green corridors treaties or to release sanctions, that's actually illegal under the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. It's also impermissible, even if Russia couches it as a countermeasure, saying that the sanctions or characterizing any of the sanctions as violations of international law. In the first place, countermeasures are not supposed to violate international human rights law, and that's prescribed under the Articles on State Responsibility. So to the extent that the hoarding is intentional, the hoarding is intended to ensure the deprivation of these human rights, I do agree that these are violations of international human rights law, as well as general international law. I mean, I'm just going to expand a little bit further on the racial discrimination argument here. There's a reason why racial discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, is also the dominant convention under which Russia has been brought to proceedings before the International Court of Justice. It is precisely because if you look at the four elements, fundamental elements of racial discrimination, that's the hook for where these human rights violations could come in. There's differential treatment that is based on a prohibited ground of race or ethnicity or national origin that has discriminatory intent and results in the impairment and deprivation of a whole host of rights. So from the human right to food to interrelated rights, we're not even talking about the right to healthy, safe, and sustainable environments here that obviously have been destroyed as a result of Russian actions. Thank you for the question.
Perhaps a more general question. It might be actually for the concluding remarks. I don't know, but one of the things that we in the Minerva Center have adopted is a temporal view of before, during, and after. And now we're very much in the during. So perhaps a question that takes a step back and asks, to the extent we have to look closely at international law with respect to, I think, this very important issue of refugees, environment, food security, the cluster of issues that is in the, what should there anything be changed in international law? Do we have the sufficient answers in terms of substantive norms and institutions in place? Or is there any lessons learned now that, to the extent that something like that happens in the future, hopefully not, but who knows, we should start working on it now. Point one. Point two is more drilled down with respect to that. One of the things that we hear about is the forceful displacement of children. They are being, quote unquote, exported from the Ukraine to the Soviet Union, allegedly for their own safety, because you want to protect youth from the vicissitudes of war and hunger that was discussed. And wouldn't life in Russia be better for them? Of course, there's an underlying issue here of, I don't want to say ethnic cleansing, but related to deportation of protected communities, etc., known to the people in this region. Those sections of the Geneva Convention are also known to people in this area. The point I want to raise is an institutional point. Let us assume that it is indeed done. It's part of a malicious campaign against the Ukraine. What do we do with it? The U.S. reported that 1.5 million, if I got the numbers right, of children that were thus deported. How on earth will the international arena will be able to somehow accommodate, document, deal with the people? Is there an international obligation to think about institutions that will therefore be there for the people later on, kids without families who were taken from the Ukraine?
Can I start with something?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with the fact that we don't actually have numbers on the number of Ukrainians, let's say, kidnapped. They are kidnapped. These are people taken into filtration camps. Russians have something called a filtration camp. They set up a camp. And there's an intelligence officer there, and the entire population gets taken to this camp. They do a background check on you. If you're a man, they strip you down. They take off your shirt to see if you have military tattoos. If you have military tattoos, they might shoot you on the spot. They might take you to another camp. Women, there is sexual assault on women in these situations. Often they just take people and they just deport them to Russia. Often poor regions of Russia, which have need of workers, which have a declining population. Often there are, as in the case of Mariupol, thousands of orphans. I mean, when you destroy a city the size of Mariupol, and there are, I talked to the mayor of Mariupol a week ago. I interviewed him at this conference a week ago. He told me that 22 27,000 dead in Mariupol, 27,000 according to the Russian numbers. But it could be as much as 100,000 because they flattened 1,300 buildings, which each had 50 family units in them. We don't know how many people are dead, and we just don't have the statistics. It must be tens of thousands of dead there. There are thousands of orphans in that situation, tens of thousands of orphans, but also hundreds of thousands of kids which were just kidnapped in these filtration camps and given to new foster parents in Russia who maybe have had problems having their own kid. And this is a way also of dealing with Russia's demographic issues and a way of destroying the Ukrainian political nation by reprogramming Ukrainian kids to be little Russians. So we don't have numbers. I expect that the Ukrainian numbers are a little bit inflated, but we just don't know. Is it 2.5 million, as they say, people who've been deported to Russia? If it's 1.5 million, I believe it. Is it 100,000 kids or 200,000 kids who've been taken to Russia? I believe it also. Horrific numbers. The numbers that, I can't get my head around 150,000 kids deported to Siberia. I just can't, There have been instances already of remarkable mothers and grandmothers, babushkas, who the mother and the father were killed in shelling, and the grandmother scraped together money and she went to Russia and she got her grandkids out. There have been a couple hundred cases like this I've heard about. Literally some larger-than-life grandmother traveling 3,000 kilometers to some periphery and part of the Russian Federation, Vladivostok, to get her grandkids out. That's not a situation that works for 100,000 kids. That doesn't work as a mass solution to the problem, as hasn't happened already. This is going to be a tremendous problem, which has not gotten enough media yet. There's no answer to this. They're kidnapping millions of people and taking them into wage slavery and basically kidnapping kids. And it's part of a wider, just the last thing I'm going to say, range of actions where the Russians are just stealing everything that's not nailed down, where the Buryat and the Chechen soldiers are allowed to take people's toasters and literally they steal people's underwear from the houses because they come from regions that are so poor. Everything from the toaster to the washing machine to the coffee machine down to the Nike sneakers and the underwear. At the highest level, the state takes containers of grain. At the mid-level, they just steal people's kids, right? They'll steal anything that's not nailed down, including children. So, talk about the movie.
Yeah. So on your 2 points. So on the first point on the institutional before and after. So I actually, and I hope that's what I tried to project with the presentation on temporary protection. I actually think this is a rare occasion where as human rights lawyer, I can say I think a framework works. Right? I think the temporary protection directive, which was intended for a crisis situation, precisely intended to suspend ordinary normal operation for a temporary period for a specific crisis, actually works when there is institutional backing for it. And so the problem here is that this is the only region in the world that has a temporary protection directive. Of course, ideally, there would be a regional framework, an international framework that would have a similar model. But I will say, actually, realistically, these crises, they do tend to be best solved in the very short term regionally. So I would say, ideally, there would be a temporary protection directive type framework in Africa, in South America, in South Asia, and the like. That would give, at least in those circumstances, a clearer pathway to how you deal with a mass influx in a way that's dignified and also is a form of responsibility. So that's on your first point. On the point around children, so you mentioned, but just for the benefit of the audience, obviously, if an area is part of the sovereign territory of Ukraine, is now occupied by Russia. Russia is removing protected populations from that area into the occupiers' territory. That's, of course, a direct, undisputed violation of Article 49.1 of the Forced Geneva Convention, because all countries are signatories, including Russia and Ukraine. So obviously there's violation here. I would say that as a consequence, there is a duty of non-recognition of that act and everything that follows from it. So to that effect, assuming those Ukrainian children have been registered in Ukrainian system as Ukrainian nationals, then an attempt, for instance, for forced nationalization, which the Russians have done, they've certainly done it idea, to try and convert Ukrainians into Russians, then that shouldn't be recognized by the country. So that if somebody's been given a passport or given a document that suggests they're not Russian, then to the extent there would be any way of reverting to the status quo ante, then that the consequence of that, short of that, that's on a legal front. What can you do to try and send, commando operations to rescue people from Siberia? That's beyond my turf.
Just a quick follow-up. You mean that if a kid like that then tries to enter the United Kingdom with a Russian passport, the United Kingdom should therefore say to this kid, sorry, we have you as a Ukrainian, you can't get in?
What I would say the best. We're going to let you in as a Ukrainian and not as a Russian.
Even though you don't have a Ukrainian passport.
Well, we will contact the Ukrainian. If that person manages to get out of Russia, I think then there should be the Ukrainian state should issue them with documentation. So it's not, these things are not pie in the sky. Actually, the number of people who have sought temporary protection in Europe and in the UK, virtually. Right, so virtually everyone who's come to the UK, 150,000 people, have come in through online applications. Right, these things are entirely doable today if there's a will.
Right, so that's an interesting point. Diane?
I just wanted to point out that this is one of those circumstances where we have to recognize that the extraordinary situation of a permanent member of the Security Council breaching the core prohibition on aggression with impunity raises serious institutional concerns at the United Nations, which is why there are pending proposals from Liechtenstein as well as from other states looking at how to dilute, if not remove, veto power that has impeded the actions of the Security Council to restore international peace and security in this conflict. But separately from that, where we have this highly aberrant situation, this doesn't mean that states don't have enforcement measures at their disposal. I've spoken previously about countermeasures and the duty not to recognize the continuing illegality. If states today are not thinking proactively about how to ensure that human rights protection, whether in the theater of environmental protection or human rights protection, or even refugee coordination on resettlement issues and guaranteeing that immigration access in the meantime, but also thinking actively about what countermeasures they can impose against the continuing breaches of Russia, I think the rest of the world isn't doing enough. When China provides that support to Russia, notwithstanding the ongoing sanctions being imposed by the rest of the countries in the world, and enables Russia to continue to prosecute this conflict because they have markets for their energy and for the oil and gas that they're depriving from Europe, that's a serious concern. So we have to think collectively, even as an international community, about whether or not we're being passive in the face of this ongoing, most serious breach of international law that has occurred since the Charter era, since the dawn of the Charter era. My main concern is as more and more of us start thinking of this as the new normal, that Russia's narrative is indeed being normalized to the extent that this is just one power versus other powers. It can't be underscored enough. And that's why I think enforcement at this rate, which is available to all states, regardless of, when I say enforcement, it should be enforcement short of the use of force, of course, because that's reserved for Security Council authorization. But short of the use of force, everybody has means of enforcement at their disposal. Even the slavery conventions have required cooperation mechanisms to detect when slavery is taking place. So to what extent are we drawing on those cooperative duties that already exist across so many treaties to ensure that protection in this most aberrant time? That's an open question at this point, but so much for this intervention.
I want to take a very last short question from Matthias Goldman, who is also with us via Zoom. Hello, Matthias. How are you?
Hi. Yeah, it's great. It's great seeing you all, and thanks, Diane, for a very comprehensive and instructive talk. I just wanted to take up the last point you mentioned that this is the most serious breach of the charter ever since it's, well, I'm not wondering for, for superlatives or going into that quest. It's definitely a very, very serious breach, but the question is periodization. I mean, at what time did the charter become moot? And to some extent, I think what we now harvest is the result of a charter that was unfit for the international order that has persisted basically since 1990. A charter that was built on, let's say, more or less, well, not exactly a Cold War situation, but a multi-power situation, and that has suffered, I would say, even normatively under the unipolar situation that we've had from 1990 onwards, or maybe from the mid 1980s. So I agree with your analysis, but I think we shouldn't be surprised why it's now in shambles.
On this happy note, unless anyone wants, I mean, I think it was more a comment than a question, and an illuminating one indeed. But if anyone wants to add a short word,
well, I'll add one sentence to Professor Desierto and the gentleman. I think his name is Matthews. There are a lot of Ukrainians who really want the United Nations to go the way of a League of the Nations, because this is an organization that no longer has a lot of legitimacy. When the Security Council is getting in the way of anything in terms of security legislation or UN votes, you could start thinking about dissolving this thing and resolve. It's not a bad idea, actually. I know you're all lawyers.
Happy note just became even happier. Okay, thanks so much for Professor Desierto, for everyone, and we're going on a short break right now.
Thank you.